So this was another thing that you talked about. It had to do with point of view and how.
The least knowledgeable character hypothesis.
Yeah, exactly. What did you call it? The epistemic regime is reversed.
So and epistemic regime isn't. I didn't make that up. That's like it's an annoying English professor term, but it basically means that every book really has this organization of knowledge, right? And we as readers figure this out pretty quickly. Whether it's a fairy tale or a modern novel. Modern novels play with it sometimes, but generally we sort of know. We know who knows what, right? We know because of the point of view. It's a first person, and the person is sort of pretending that they don't know how this comes out, or they know how the whole story comes out, and they're still telling the story, or we're getting the point of view filtered through different characters, and this is sort of the standard move is, we call it third person limited omniscient, right? So it's from somebody else's point of view, and they know some of the things going on, but they don't read everybody's mind, or something like that. So that's pretty just standard lit crit stuff. I think my contribution in that is just to recognize that in almost every case in the Lord of the Rings, the focalizing character is the one who knows the least.
Right.
Which is not normal. Like, it's the normal regime. Now, this is actually very normal in children's books, I will say. That's a trick that children's authors use, right? Because then they can have the kind of wide-eyed and surprised, their children narrators are always surprised when people do crappy things, or they're not surprised when, like, a magical creature pops up and saves them.
Well, this is actually why I bring it up, because you mentioned having to figure out these things in the story, and it kind of reminded me of being a child again, and I think you mentioned this in your lecture about having to kind of learn like you did when you were younger, along with the characters, right? This whole, because the characters don't know as much, you're kind of learning along with them. Is that
yeah?
Right?
And my kind of assertion, which this should be like, I tell my students all the time when I say one of these things, they put an asterisk and say wacky Drout theory because it's not mainstream. But my assertion would be that when you're learning along with a character, it's actually the only time that you and the character are feeling exactly the same thing. Because if the character's thirsty, you don't feel thirsty. Like, you think about thirsty, right? You can even trick yourself a little into it if the character's in pain. But if the character's learning, the character's brain and your brain are doing the same thing at that moment. And it's probably because Tolkien, he was a professor and he was a father, and he performed things out loud to his group of friends. And in each case, then, like, they're learning about the world and the story, and they're making the connections that you're supposed to make to understand it. And sometimes those are just what you can get from context, like the cats of Queen Beruthiel, right? Where Tolkien didn't even have the story written when he said that. Like, that's just flat out like, well, okay, they're cats. They must see in the dark. I get it. And notice, right, then he never has Pippin go, the cats of who? It's like, it's just that's part of the lore of the world there. And other times, it is stuff from the Silmarillion mythology that's sort of percolating up through the story. And it's that deep and consistent backstory that actually makes the whole, that makes the Lord of the Rings different, though now that's, of course, what everyone imitates. Like, when you go to my students, some of them have gone to these workshops, like how to write your first fantasy novel, and it's like not even like design characters, but it's like start making up your Bible for your world. It's very D&D, right? It is totally D&D. It's start making up your Bible for your world. Like, you can do the geography and the geology and the biomes and the plants and build all that up, because then it'll have that. And this is the impression of depth, I think. It's an underlying consistency.
Yeah.
And not just, and this is, I've read, so I don't encourage this, because there's no market for fantasy novels right now, because it's just flooded, so many people have written them. And my students, if they bring me one, they want me to help them get it published. I'm like, I couldn't tell you how to get my own published if I had it. It's like it. But it's usually like the chapter 2, the Treatise of Tedium of a bad fantasy novel, which is the information dump.
Yeah.
And I mean, Tolkien does it a little bit in Shadow of the Past, but if you notice how he does it, he at least makes it dramatic. He's clever about it, right? Frodo has to actually drag the information out of Gandalf. Mm-hmm. I think it works pretty well because you as the reader, again, you become like Frodo, right? Like you're grasping at little pieces and you just, instead of saying, okay, here we go, and now we're having a lecture on the Elder Days. How many kings were there? 37? Oh, and you're going to list all of them?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Instead, you are like, come on, Gandalf, give me more information here. I want to know about this Dark Lord. And why do you keep saying things like, someday I'll tell you all the story?
Yeah.
And that's a good trick. But it's still a trick, and it's still that you need that. But I think that the least knowledgeable character makes Tolkien's more artful. And where I came up with that was I noticed that there's, the focal character is almost always a hobbit, which would make sense because they're usually the least knowledgeable, except in the beginning of the Two Towers where it's Gimli.
Right.
And that makes sense because Gimli's never been in that part of the world before. Mm-hmm. And Gimli doesn't know what's going on. And it's, and the only other time is like when Gimli narrates a chunk of the Paths of the Dead story. And even then he's like, and at this point, I don't know what happened. I have to have Legolas tell the story. And Legolas is like, well, I didn't really understand what was happening because I don't understand these ghosts and things. It's like so consistent that whoever has the least knowledge is focalizing the story. So therefore, it feels natural that the creator of the story is giving you this background information.
Yep. Well, we've talked a lot about Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. As I mentioned, I'm a big Silmarillion fan. And you've talked a lot about Turin tonight. I talked a lot about Turin. If we could, when I had Corey on the podcast, we played a little game, and we kind of talked a little bit about what was going on at the story up until that point, and I mentioned some liberties that I had taken where I kind of extended the things that Tolkien had written about, things like I created something called Durin's March, right, which was this account of it was kind of like the Freedom Trail in Boston, right, where when Durin woke up in Mount Gundabad and sort of made his way to the Mirror. It was not necessarily the path that he took, but it was the pilgrimage route that dwarves took.
I love that
to sort of and so we talked about that a little bit, and we whether that was something that could be legit or whether it wouldn't work in the context of the lore. So bringing all this back together, we're at a point in the story now where obviously this is about a D&D campaign where and the characters have just they've just gotten to the Tower of Pearl, where inside of the Tower of Pearl we know that there is this sleeper who isn't really identified, although I've heard that Christopher Tolkien maybe thinks it's Idril,
that's a neat point. Okay.
So I don't think anyone has ever really identified who the sleeper is. Of course, I took liberties, and because this is all leading up to the Dagor-Dagorath, and Turin is in that prophecy, the sleeper in this case for me was Turin-Turambar. And the first question you would probably ask is, well, Turin-Turambar isn't in the Tower of Pearl, so how is he the sleeper? And so, and my answer to that is, there was a pool in the Tower of Pearl that would answer to the desires of your hearts, both in terms of location and in loved ones. And the characters traveled from the Tower of Pearl to the Stone of the Hapless because they had been told the second prophecy of Mondos about the Dagor-Dagorath and about Turin-Turambar. And so they go to the Stone of the Hapless, where they realize that Turin-Turambar has been awakened. And so he is a sleeper no longer. And so Turin is kind of a very pivotal. Not only is he one of my favorite Tolkien characters, but he's a very pivotal character in the Dungeons and Dragons campaign that I DM'd. So if we were going to play the game, I guess I'd love to ask you a question, and maybe we could just talk about whether this could happen or whether this doesn't fit really in the sort of mythos. Does that work for you?
Yeah, we can. Let's see.
Okay, so the first one is when they're in. So the men of Brethil had turned the Stone of Talbur, Stone of the Hapless, Tol Morwen, whatever you want to call it, into kind of like a series of catacombs because they didn't want people coming in to steal the relics of Turin. And so the characters get there, and when they discover the tomb of Turin is empty, they also discover an elf that's in the catacombs, sort of still being Turin's caretaker and friend, and that is Nellis, the Lady of the Woods, who came to his rescue when people were accusing him of murdering one of the elves, so here she is, and she kind of explains sort of what had happened, and she's still sort of kicking around. So tell me, I mean, could Nellis still be hanging around?
She's an immortal elf. I mean, she can sort of do what she wants. I mean, I guess so when is this happening?
So this is
in the beginning of the Fourth Age.
Yeah, so that's
okay.
That's also something else that we could kind of talk about. Is in my campaign, when characters travel across the Straight Road, whether it be via the Allora Male or the Path of Dreams, or on one of Círdan's ships. Time doesn't. It's not like, oh, I'm gonna just like sail for a couple of weeks. It's like they sail, and then 60 years later, right? Not really. It's not been 60 years for them, but time is not just like, oh, the sun's gonna come up and it's tomorrow. The sun's gonna come up.
Sure. I mean, that's pretty normal. I mean, and Tolkien has had There's stuff like that with Thingol and Melian and the night. So I'm not in disagreement with that at all.
Okay. So when they each time when the characters travel across the Straight Road, and this will be so they first came across from when. At the end of the first part of the campaign, they had to sort of go to the Lonely Isle. So that's about 60 years, right? So we were at right after the last meeting of the White Council when we first started, and about 60 years after that, and then they came to the Stone of the Hapless, went into the pool, traveled to the Tol Morwen, 60 more years. So we're looking at right around the beginning of the Fourth Age at this point.
So I don't see why you couldn't have Nellis there, because that's the thing is Elvish time goes differently, and especially if you're linked in if you're building this into with a prophecy, and the elves seem to know more about those sorts of things. I can absolutely see her devoting herself to the care of the tomb and being there. I mean, I don't think that there's any real lore problems with that at all.
Okay. And you said the passing of the time is something that's
yeah. There's plenty of things like when they're in Lothlorien and it takes a month longer than they realize, and there's a real question, and nobody's really straightened this out, but there's a time discrepancy in the timelines in Shelob's Lair. And we got an article submitted for Tolkien Studies that I liked a lot, but for a bunch of reasons we weren't able to publish it, and I think somebody else did, that said that Shelob was sort of like the anti-Galadriel, and time moved faster in Shelob's Lair, or slower. I forget, whatever it was, it accounted for the discrepancy, which is interesting. So the different time flows, I think that's totally legitimate. I mean, especially when you're interacting with elves.
Awesome.
They just do time differently. That's what Legolas says, right? The years pass both faster and slower for us.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess the last thing that I would ask you about was we're at Tol Morwen, and so it's about the dagger that I called what did I call it? I called it Hathadal, which in talking with Fiona Jawlings, who's a Sindarin expert, I realized I butchered that name. I wanted it to be in reference to Sador's lame foot. He was called Labadel, so I tried to name it something called Foot Cleaver. Well, of course, I butchered that name, but so we know from the children of Húrin and the story of Turin that his father gave Turin a dagger. It was an elvish made dagger, and because Turin loved Sador so much, he and really that's all Turin had to give. He gave Sador this knife, this dagger, and Sador kept it with him, grudgingly at first, but then came to love it, obviously. And when Turin left, and the Easterlings kind of took over that area. When Sador finally passed, I said in my story, Sador, sort of Morwen kind of took the knife, and when she finally came to the Stone of the Hapless and sort of died there and was buried in my story, the knife that came from originally probably Dorloman would be right, or Gondolin maybe, some sort of it was an elf dagger. Ends up with my characters that are in my campaign. They find it in Morwen's tomb. Is that something that's possible, or is
I mean it Sting,
right?
Sting, right? If we don't have a backstory for Sting, interestingly, it's just a glowy Gondolin sword knife. It was just a knife, right? But it was as good as a short sword for a hobbit that ended up in the troll trove with the sword of Turgon's sword. How did the trolls plunder, Turgon's corpse? Or somebody did,
right?
Or somebody found something, or somebody saved it in a positive way, and then the trolls robbed them, and it passed down and passed down. I mean, and what from Gondolin to what did I figure it out? Eregion. The Eregion ruins are 6,000 years old.
Yeah.
Or something like that when they walk on them. So Gondolin, I mean, obviously there's a way for artifacts to survive for tens of thousands of years.
Well, there's
in Middle Earth.
There's actually speculation online, as you can find it anywhere, but that Sting was actually Sador's knife.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just that's the fun part about all this is you can make up a story, and I don't know any of the Sting speculations. I imagine there's some good fan fiction then that would figure that out. There's different. One of the things that I really liked in Lord of the Rings Online was one of the quests that you had to do there was to get some made up random stone so that the elf smiths, when they reforged Broken Narsil into Andoril, could do it.
Oh, right.
It was a great quest. There was a giant killer turtle that spawned millions of little baby murder turtles, and and some of those things are always a little bit silly, but that's why, I mean, at the beginning before we were recording, we were talking about I made D&D campaigns in Middle Earth when I was in high school, and that's what you want to do. You want to explore it, and by explore, it's not just the physical. I wanted to go all those places. I still do, but it's also to explore the story, and it works so well as a complex realized world that the fan fiction that we do when we create and add to it. You can there are things in Lord of the Rings Online that I think, that would be perfect. I mean, Tolkien must have thought that way. And then you see the way he came up with stuff, and actually probably it's too simple, even the most complicated things.
Yeah.
That we come up with, that he would have 7 different other layers there. But it's no, I think that's I was just looking at it. My Middle Earth thing, you're finding the Elendilmir and the Elessar and the Scepter of Anuminas, which would sort of indicate that Aragorn's tomb got plundered, or even more what happened to the current King of Gondor who should have those things?
Yeah.
Or were they stolen? But that's what makes a great campaign. And there is something special in Tolkien, like these artifacts. I've done some work on, and we're publishing a piece of the new Tolkien studies should be out in the next. It's already available online. It should be physically available in the next week or so. And the lead article is about Tolkien's treasures and idea of treasures in museums and hoards and places where treasures are displayed or are gathered. And there's, think about how many people that have pre-Peter Jackson made a wizard staff or a file of Galadriel or a costume piece or something like that. And that's really weird for literature. You don't see people making I don't know what you'd make for Hemingway or Faulkner. I guess a flask mansion or a drunk guy, or big dead fish maybe. But that wanting to have the way he comes up with these incredible artifacts, and you want to touch them and see them, and so the D&D campaign is another way to do that. I think in the end, I've said this before. We all want to go to Middle Earth.
Yes, we do.
And we'll go there. The reading is in some ways the most immersive way, just because you get to create it in your brain exactly as you think it should be. But between the movies and the go to New Zealand tourism and the people doing cosplay and creating little bits of Middle Earth, or the people building hobbit holes. Vernon Flieger has this whole thing where all these hobbit holes for sale. And I know someone who her husband passed away, and he said, go build the hobbit hole you've always wanted.
Oh.
And she has this gorgeous house. It's a house, not a hole, but it's got a round door and it's all inside. That.
Lots of coat pegs.
Yeah, we want to be there.
Yeah.
And the Silmarillion the same way. I want to walk over that little rise and see the 7 gates of Gondolin and everything.
Yeah.
Lined up, or go to Nargothrond, or see the rainbow cleft. So Ted Nasmith brings these things to visual life, and Peter Jackson films them, and Lord of the Rings Online makes them, and eventually we'll have an Oculus thing where we can wander around it. But D&D lets us go there and do stuff.
Yeah.
And do stuff that's on our own. Obviously shaped by the Dungeon Master, but still more than just following a script. And I think that's in the end what, Tolkien was an artist, and there's all the IP and copyright and this and that. But in the end, his story, Leaf by Niggle, is about the dream is to make create a world that other people can go into. And he did it.
Yeah, he did.
That's the great. He writes this up as his this allegory. Clearly, the only super personal allegory thing he ever wrote, and it's basically heaven is being inside your own painting, and inviting other people to come and join. And damn, if that's not exactly what he's done.
So if I could, this is a good place for me to sort of, I'm gonna quote you, and this will bring us full circle. So in your talk at Carnegie Mellon, you answered this question: how do you read Tolkien? By paying attention to the ways that different features of his work combine to produce and transform sadness. Not into bitterness, but into something richer, greater, something fully human. Reading Tolkien this way, you see the true scope of his achievement to touch the heart, and you understand how much more fully Sam's words, "Well, I'm back," are both joyous and heartbreaking. I thought that was a nice way to end.
Yeah, I think I'm not going to do better than that improvising. The Lord, it doesn't. I teach it every 2 years, and it doesn't get old. It doesn't get old to read it. It doesn't get old to talk to students about it. And the best students are the ones that I cherish are those who've never read it before. And I had a student. I'm not making this up. This week, maybe we can end with this story. I had a student whose name is Lorien.
Huh.
Right? Her father named her Lorien because of the Lord of the Rings.
Sure.
And she'd never read it.
No.
She'd always refused for whatever reason. And then she became my research assistant.
Oh my.
So she had to read it. And then she's like, oh my gosh, why did I miss out on this for so long? And she's just about to have her first 2 young adult novels published.
Wow.
But just like that, that student was a great student to teach, because as she's reading it, she's like, now I understand why my dad loves this so much. And now I understand, even why I was named what I was named.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a great experience as a teacher to get to work with people who are seeing it for the first time. And then the people like us who are seeing it for the 50th time, but are still seeing it in a different new way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we could probably talk about this for another 4 hours, but I just wanted to say thank you for coming on the podcast, and maybe we can talk again sometime in the future.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.
This could be maybe our blooper reel, but so when Corey was on the show, he said that you gave him such a hard time about that definite article, the Tolkien professor. So I was wondering if you had to create your podcast, right? If you were starting up a podcast, the Michael Drout whatever podcast, what would the name of your podcast be? And you have to include the definite article.
I have to include the definite article?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, geez. That's a good test. I have like names for things that I want to use, or that I have used, but like what would I be? Oh, geez. I'm trying to think of something that's like not totally obnoxious either, but
it can be obnoxious. I think that would be even better.
Oh, well, I mean, if I was really being obnoxious, my answer would be, like, it wouldn't have a definite article. It would be just called, like, I told you so, but you wouldn't listen to me. It needs, like, to be one of those, like, exasperated Gandalf, like, throw yourself in next time.